All right, welcome back, everybody. We are picking up where we last left off in the conclusion of 1 Kings. 1 Kings ended at the death of our main villain, Ahab, of the northern kingdom of Israel, and his rival Elijah is going to have his conclusion here at the beginning of 2 Kings. And then the rest of the first half is really going to focus on his successor, Elisha, which will have many stories, encounters, stories of miracles, and of course continue the assignments that Elijah originally had to seek vengeance upon the house of Ahab. So if you remember, Jezebel persecuted many of the prophets, the Yahwehists, and at Mount Sinai, God gave him an assignment to anoint these two kings, Ahazel and Jehu, who are going to seek vengeance and tear down the house of Ahab. So we're going to read about that. And in our second part of 2 Kings for our next session, we're going to focus on the post-Elijah and Elisha era, where you have all your famous prophets, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, all the prophets you know and love. We're going to hear more about them. Their warnings or oracles that are ultimately not heeded, and the destruction of both kingdoms eventually. So first the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom, which will take place at the end of 2 Kings. So let's start off at the beginning, hearing about the conclusion to Elijah's ministry. So if you remember Ahaziah, we talked a little bit about him last time. He's Ahab's son. We started out the story with him, and when he reigns, he's going to have his first political trouble in Moab. So if you remember, Solomon took all these rival tribes around Israel and put them under submission. So they are vessels of the kingdom of Israel. And Moab is getting, rambunctious, not paying tribute like they should. And so Ahaziah is dealing with that, and as he does, he has an accident. He falls out of his palace window and injures himself. And so he goes and instantly wants to send messengers to Baal-zebub, which is the god of his mother, Jezebel, to go to see if he's going to recover. So an angel goes and tells Elijah that. And of course, Elijah's obviously not going to be happy with this. And so he goes and cuts off the messenger that's going to Baal-zebub and says, hey, what is, Ahaziah doing, not looking for the God of Israel instead of looking for this false god? And because of that, he's going to be, condemned to death. And so the messenger is like, okay, so he goes back to Ahaziah and says, I found this strange guy, this strange hairy guy that tells me that you're going to be judged and you're going to die because you didn't go to the God of Israel. And Ahaziah is like, oh my goodness, that Elisha. Nothing but trouble. So just like his dad, Ahab and Ahaziah are going to be frustrated by Elijah and Elisha. Continuing on, he is upset. He's like, oh my goodness, how dare this Elijah guy tell me this? So he's going to send a general to go with 50 troops and go arrest Elijah on this hill. And so they go and, get up to this hill and go and say, man of God, come down this minute. And so Elijah comes up with this kind of nice little pun. So in the Hebrew, man of God is Esh, so man Esh, Elohim, God. So man of God, so if I'm a man of God, if I'm an Ish Elohim, then, may Esh Elohim come down. So Esh is fire. So he makes this little pun, says, okay, if I'm a man of God, then I guess, fire of God's going to come down on you. And of course it does. And boom, just like the sacrifice at Mount Carmel, this fire comes down and consumes these captain and his 50 men. So Ahaziah is like, okay, round number 2, gets his captain to do it again. Same thing happens. And then the third captain's a little, wises up to this, and he goes to Elijah and is like, please don't kill me, please. We know that you have that power. So don't kill me, please. And so an angel consults Elijah and says, hey, just go in peace and everything will be okay. Ahaziah is not going to hurt you. So Elijah kind of submits and is arrested back to Ahaziah in Samaria and goes and tells exactly what he said originally, that because of his insubordination to Yahweh, that he is going to die because of his injuries, and of course it comes true. So he passes away, and because he has no sons, Ahab's second oldest son, Jehoram, also called Joram, but we're going to try to get because there's another Jehoram. We're going to try to make the name simple for you guys, so we'll try to have different names for each of these kings. So Jehoram succeeds him as king to take over. Chapter 2 is all about Elijah's ascension to heaven. So there's just this very long narrative that builds up where Elijah and Elisha are, journeying in Gilgal, and Elijah's like, hey, Elisha, I'm about to leave, I'm called to somewhere else, stay here, and kind of like Ruth to Naomi, Elisha's going to be like, no, I'll never leave your side. So, he follows him, and as they travel, they get closer and closer to the Jordan River. They go to Bethel, they go to Jericho, with his disciples always telling him that, your master is going to be taken up, and Elisha's like, oh, I know. So you get this tension that's building up until they finally reach the Jordan River. And once they arrive there, Elijah will roll up his mantle, his little cloak, strike the water, and then just like what happened with Joshua and Moses, it will split open, divided into two waves, and they'll cross. And as they're crossing into the Transjordan region, they're having just a casual conversation, and Elisha turns to him and says, hey, what do you have, like a final request before I'm taken up? And Elisha will say, hey, can I have what's usually translated in your Bible, a double portion? But what that really means is just the prime inheritance that an eldest son would have. So just this prime inheritance from Elijah's spirit is what he requests. And Elijah will say, as I go up, if you see me, you will receive that gift. But if you do not see me, then you will not. And so before he can even say anything else, all of a sudden this chariot just comes down from heaven, this fiery chariot, picks up Elijah, and a whirlwind just kind of makes him vanish. And as he's coming up, Elijah's mantle just falls to the ground, or in between these two waters. And Elisha will just be sad, but he goes and picks up that mantle. And so he continues on, crosses across to the Transjordan River, and then once he reaches the other side of the Jordan, the waters close up, and then afterwards he's like, all right, let me see if this came true. He tests it out himself, strikes the mantle, and then the sea will divide again. And so he crosses back to where he came from, going towards Jericho. And as he's crossing back, the disciples see Elisha crossing and says, oh my goodness, this is a real deal. This is the true successor to our master Elijah. So Elisha becomes a new Yahweh's prophet. And so when they come back, it's kind of funny. So the disciples at first are like, hey, maybe this chariot, went somewhere local, let's check. Kind of the wilderness. Let's, maybe he went back to Mount Carmel. So, who knows really where Elijah went to. And Elijah's like, no, I really think he's gone. I don't think he's coming back. But they take about 3 days of a search party that never come up and find Elijah. So, now they conclude that Elisha is going to be the prophet from here on out. Okay, so now we get to the beginning of his ministry, and he does quite a few miracle stories. The first one, when he gets back to Jericho, there's water that's polluted, but after adding some salt, wham, this is, the spring is now purified, as it is to this day, which the author observes that I guess there's, at one point, it was a well-known spring that wasn't pure, but now it is. And then there's a really funny story that I always share with my youth group, in case they ever make fun of my bald head, because you never know what comes out of it, right? So Elisha is leaving Jericho, and he's going north towards Bethel. Or you can kind of follow here, so going up here towards Bethel. And And on the road there, when he arrives at Bethel, there's these young boys that come out that go and taunt him and call him baldy. And Elisha will just curse them, and God's wrath will be upon them. And so these two bears will come out and start mauling the little boys. It doesn't say that they kill him, they kill the boys, but apparently they teach them a very severe lesson. And so he continues on to his journey from Bethel to Mount Carmel to finally back to the Israelite capital of Samaria. Chapter 3 is going to focus on the story of Moab's independence. So if you remember, so Ahaziah, the Ahab's son that just passed away, had that little trouble in Moab, trying to get them back in line. So now his brother Jehoram is going to have that same problem on his plate, and he is... we have a little bit more details of what started this. So after Ahab died, the Mesha, who was a sheep breeder, that was giving like this exorbitant amount of annual tribute of like 100 sheets of wool and stuff like that from his sheep. He's just like, hey, if Ahab's dead, I don't have to pay this anymore. So he refuses to pay tribute. So Jehoram will, teach them a lesson. And Jehoshaphat, who is also, has a vested interest in keeping these vessels in line, will join him along with Judah's vessel, Edom. So this puppet king of Edom will also kind of help out this triad. So this is going to be the first time, I guess Jehoshaphat has both times made a joint venture with the kingdom of Israel. First with Ahab at Ramoth Gilead, and this is the second time to invade to invade Moab. So if you look at the map here, usually you would just do where Elisha and Elijah went, cross the Jordan, enter in the north of Moab around this area, and do a straightforward invasion. But Jehoram is really clever. He's like, let's do a little sneak attack. Let's go all the way down south past Judah and get our, Edomite king back here, join this alliance and go all the way around the Dead Sea and surprise them on their southern flank. So they're like, yeah, great idea. So they go, they travel 7 days, and it ends up not being such a great idea because they run out of food, they run out of water. And they're like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? The army's starving, it's, thirsty. And so they go consult Elisha. And Elisha's just like, man, you do know that I hate you, Jehoram. I hated your dad, I hated your brother. But because of Jehoshaphat, he's a pretty cool guy, so, I'll help you guys, I guess. So he goes, tells them, hey, go get this musician to go and do this chant, and afterwards there is going to be a flood of water. That's not going to come from rain, but just this stream that I assume is going to be around this area and south of it, and it'll open up this opportunity to get you guys back on track. And so they do so, and all this water will come in, and from there, they're like, okay, now they're ready to invade. And so at this time, Mesha gets word that they are about to invade from the southern end. So he gets all of his northern troops that are stationed up north and really gets his attention down south. So they bring it and they do some reconnaissance. And as they are spying out on the Israelite camp, they see all this red. So they see this big stream of water. They probably see the sandstone redness reflected from the water, and so they're thinking, oh, it's blood. The three kings are all attacking each other. So it's a perfect opportunity to go surprise them and sneak attack on them. So they do that, which was a huge mistake. So now they're outside of their walls, they're outside of their fortress, any protection, and they go out and they try to bring down this this enormous alliance of three different kingdoms, and of course get completely decimated. So they lose. They're retreating back to their walls in Edom, and so the Israelite alliance is counterattacking. They're invading Moab. They get to their capital over in Selah, and just overrun the place. And during this time, Mesha is just like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And he has this brilliant idea, throws a Hail Mary, and just like, okay, I'm going to sacrifice my son, my eldest son, and maybe that will turn the tides. And it's just in this really confusing, controversial passage, he sacrifices his son, and the whole thing turns. So Elisha's prophecy doesn't come true. Instead, the tide of battle completely turns, and it says that a great wrath falls upon Israel. And so the army is defeated, and Moab fends off the coalition who has to force to withdraw. So, we don't know who this God, whose God this son was sacrificed, but apparently it's effective. So ever since this sacrifice, now they're forced to go and withdraw, and with that, Moab will get their independence from Israel. Next, we're going to have just a lot of different series of stories that we're going to try to go through quick, of just anecdotal stories of Elisha doing these cool miracles. So the first one is one of his disciples is husband just passed away. So with that, the credit, apparently the family had debt, and the creditors are going to come and enslave their children in order to pay off this debt. And she's going to Elisha asking what to do, and Elisha advises, like, okay, what do you have? What can you offer? And she's like, oh, I have this, jar of oil, and that's all. So he says, okay, well, go borrow some vessels, some jars from all your different neighbors, and pour that oil into each of those jars. So she does. She collects these jars and pours the oil, and the oil just never runs out. She keeps pouring until she has enough to pay off her debt. And Elisha says, hey, you're going to have enough to pay off your debt and then some. So, take that profit and use it to, raise you and your son. And so that's the first miracle mentioned here. Next is the woman from Schumann. So Schumann is kind of up here near the Jezreel Valley. So this is, if you remember Schumann, it was mentioned where Abigail, David's caretaker, that was a little controversial, trying to get married to one of his sons. That's where her hometown is. So Elisha and his disciples are kind of traveling up north, passing through this area pretty frequently. And so this wealthy woman from that town goes up to them and says, hey, come for a meal. So every time he's traveling and the disciples are traveling, they get kind of a nice warm meal whenever they're in town. And over time, the woman's like, hey, talks to her husband and says, we're all, they're always in town. Let's just go ahead and make them, a little apartment. So they go and, furnish a little apartment for him and his disciples whenever they're in town. And Elisha's just like, man, that's awesome. How can we repay him? So he goes and turns to one of his close attendants named Gehazi and asks, hey, Gehazi, what's a great idea to say thank you to this lady? And Gehazi's like, well, you do know that she's never had children, her husband's very old, and so they decide, what about this? We'll have an oracle where, this time next year she'll have a son. So the woman doesn't believe it, but, a year later, bam, here comes the son. And so over time, the son grows up, and one day complains about this headache to his father, and the father takes it to the mother, and then, he kind of dies, or seemingly dies, when he's on the mother's lap. And so the mother is just, taking fate into her own hands. She's packing for this long journey, all the way from Schumann, all the way over here towards Mount Carmel, and towards the coast, and she will go and travel on her own with some servants to go and ask Elisha for help. So Elisha will send out Gehazi to first go check out the boy, and he's not able to do anything, so eventually they go back and get Elisha. And Elisha will do that same sort of respiratory ritual that Elijah did, where he'll just kind of go face-to-face, hand-to-hand with this boy, and after, sneezing 7 times, he'll be revived, and will have his eyes open, and so that concludes that miracle. The next miracle, there's going to be a famine in Gilgal, And there's kind of two stories within it. So the first story is that, that he goes and instructs the people there to gather these ingredients to make a stew. And so they make the stew, and he's like, oh my goodness, like it tasted, horrible, like, spoiled. And Elisha's like, oh, let me get you this flour. And so this flour just, somehow makes everything better, and so it becomes edible, and now the village has this stew that helps them. Another story, a guy approaches Elisha with 20 loaves of bread, and Elisha says, go distribute it to the whole village. And the man's like, man, there's only like 20 loaves, can barely feed my family with it. But he's like, no, just trust me, go ahead and do it. And so he distributes all these loaves, and, miraculously, just kind of like the story of Jesus and the loaves and the fish, just never runs out, and it was enough for the whole village. The next story is the miracle of Naaman's leprosy. So this is a strange story because Naaman isn't an Israelite, he's actually an enemy. If you remember Aram, this longtime rival that went to war with Ahab, has this general who's very highly esteemed, but has leprosy. And during one of their conquests in Israel, they go and kidnap this little girl, and this little girl is kind of forced to be a servant of Naaman's wife. And this young girl is like, hey, I'm sure your master will get healing from one of Israel's prophets named Elisha. Maybe he can heal Naaman's ailment. So Naaman goes to the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, and says, hey, can we, make some sort of agreement with the king of Israel? So he goes to Jehoram, gives him all these gifts, and says, hey, can you please heal my great general Naaman? And of course, Jehoram, just like Elisha can't stand him, he can't stand him either, and he's like, oh my goodness, there's no way this guy's going to heal him, and he's going to just make a pretext to go to war with Aram again, like this is just a disaster. And so Elisha gets word of this. He's like, hey, just give me the guy, and we'll set things right. So he goes over. So Naaman goes to Elisha's house and says, hey, all I have to do is go 7 times to Jordan River, and you're all good. And Naaman's like, really? No way. It can't be that easy. Like, there's got to be something more to it. And he's like, nope, go. And so the advisors are just like, yeah, just listen to this guy and see what happens. What harm can it do? So he goes, and of course he gets healed. He's like, oh my goodness. And he has this great conversion where he becomes a Yahwehist. He believes that the God of Israel is the only one true God, which was, of course, the minority position throughout this time period. And he's like, oh my goodness, what can I give you guys? How can I help your Yahwehist movement? Let me give you some gifts. Let me give you some, this or that. And oh, by the way, please forgive me. Ben-Hadad, when we go to the temple, he forces me to go bow down to his god, Rimmon. But really, I still want to just be loyal to Yahweh. So Elisha's like, this isn't Yahweh's a for-profit God. Just be healed and go in peace. So he goes and leaves, and Gehazi gets word of this. He's like, what? He's not going to give us anything. So he goes behind Elisha's back and says, hey, oh my goodness, we have these 2 new disciples. They need a scholarship program. They need some clothing. Do you mind, paying a little bit for them? And of course, Naaman's like, oh, of course, gives them more than what he asked. And so he goes and sneakily deposits the money that Naaman gives them. And so he's going back to Elisha's, like, wondering what he's going to do for the day. And Elisha, of course, knows exactly what's happening. And so he goes and says, no, Elisha, like, how, no, Gehazi, how could you have done this? The curse of leprosy that Naaman has is going to cling to you and your descendants forever because of this. So, of course, he runs away sad, and right when he does it, his skin turns white as snow. So, poor Gehazi. The next story is going to be the floating axe head. So one day, the disciples of Elisha are like, man, this place is so cramped. Let's get some more lumber near the Jordan River, build, kind of do some renovations and build a little bit more space for everybody. So he's like, okay. And they asked Elisha to go join them. And so during this log cutting expedition, I guess the axes were a pretty or a much more rare commodity that was treasured. So one of the disciples borrowed this precious axe, and the axe head, while he's chopping wood, just falls off, and it falls into the river. Like, oh my goodness, how am I going to repay this person for this axe? And so Elisha, he says, oh, where is it? And so he points it out where it is, and suddenly it floats up, and he grabs it. And I'm like, wow, so that's this last little miracle story of this series. So the next section, starting in chapter 6 of verse 8. So now we're going to focus back on Israel's war between Ben-Hadad and Aram and Jehoram in Israel. So Jehoram and Ben-Hadad, just like Ahab and Ben-Hadad, they're always at war. They're always clashing over the northern territories up in this area, up north. And Elisha will, tell them, the plan for this encampment or that encampment, strategizing where to go, where to place troops. And Ben-Hadad is trying to ambush them and set up these traps, but every time they go to Elisha, he tells them, no, don't go there, they're going to ambush you here. And so this happens over and over again. And then finally, Ben-Hadad's like, who is a mole? Who is the one telling them, spilling our intelligence out? And they warn him about Elisha, like, oh, Elisha's, close to God. He's revealing all your intel. And so, of course, they can't have any of this. So they go and bring chariots to Dothan, which is this little small town north of Samaria, the capital. And so they surround Elisha there, and the attendants wake him up early in the morning and saying, oh my goodness, the enemy's surrounding us. What shall we do, master? And Elisha will first pray to show the disciples, belief in God. So these heavenly hosts of God, these invisible forces, are actually surrounding them, protecting them. And then he does a second prayer for this blinding light to come out and blind these troops. So, God does. He blinds all these troops that are surrounding Elijah, and so they're kind of helpless. They can't see. And so Elisha turns out to be a really nice guy, and instead of killing them or doing anything, they go and take them. He's like, hey, I'm not the man you're looking for. Let me take you to the king, your enemy king that you're after. And so they lead him out south to Samaria and takes this army there. And Jehoram is really puzzled. He sees this big army, all blinded. What should we do with them? Should we kill them all? And Elisha basically says, that's not your right. God is the one doing this, not your army. So what you should do is, feed them like guests, comfort them. And Jehoram's like, okay. So he goes and gives them a feast to these enemy troops. And they go away peacefully back to his army and doesn't do another raid from this army. So a lovely little story there. And next is going to be a full-scale invasion. So Ben-Hadad is going to have this siege of Samaria. He's going all out. And during this time, there's just this crazy bad famine. So the whole city's, we talked a little bit about how siege warfare worked. You don't go in there guns blazing. What do? You starve out the enemy until they're too weak. Then you overtake the city. So that's the process that's happening right now. And during this time, the King Jehoram, he's kind of on his rampart over the gates, and he hears this woman, tell this heartbreaking story of how, her and her friend were supposed to, take turns killing each other's son to feed on him, and, it started out with her, and the next day when her son was supposed to be eaten, she backed out. And so he hears the story, he's like, oh my goodness, how has this, kingdom come to this? And so, of course, he does what Ahab and all these kings do, blame Elisha. And so he's like, oh my goodness, get this Elisha guy over here. He foresaw this. And so he goes to Elisha's house, and, the king and his aide will be there, and he says, by this time tomorrow, the market prices where everything is inflated, they'll come back to normal. Pre-famine ways, signifying that the famine's going to be over. And, the aide that's leaning on his arm is really skeptical. He's like, oh, really? Snickering at him. And he's like, but you aide, you're not going to see this. You'll witness it, but you're not going to eat from it. So we're at the end, we're going to find out what that means. So time goes by, during this day, and 4 lepers who are outside the city are like, if we go inside, we're going to starve to death. If we stay here, we're going to starve to death. Well, let's go to the enemy encampment and hope for the best. So they go to where the Arams are encamped, and apparently God did this miracle where, made sounds of stampedes, and so it scared off this army. And so the lepers come to it and sees they leave behind all their food, all their resources, and they're like, oh my goodness, this could feed a village. And, there's so many, so there's just these streams, this whole road of different, encampments and tents. And so over time, they're like, oh my goodness, we can't, keep this secret forever. So they go back to Samaria and tell the king about all this. And so the king is like, okay, well, let's go, make sure it's not a booby trap. And after they confirm that it is indeed the real deal, that, these camps are really abandoned, then he tells the whole city and has that aide leading on the door, watch the gate. And of course, the people are all stampeding out and crush that aide to death. So just like Elisha will say that, he will see the day, but not eat from it. So the people go to the camp, loot it, and get all the food, and waits out the famine. And the invasion obviously is called off. So this next section is going to be, 8 through 10, is going to be about picking off where Elijah left off. So if you remember at Mount Sinai, God assigned him 3 tasks. He's going to anoint Hazael, Jehu to be king, to seek vengeance on the house of Ahab, and also to anoint Elisha. So he did number 3. So Elisha is going to do the first 2 that he was supposed to have. And now we're going to focus on the new king of Aram, Hazael. But first, we're going to also pick up that story from chapter 4, the Schumann woman with the son that was revived. So we don't really know where this story fits chronologically, but apparently the famine, there's like a 7-year famine. It might be related to Samaria, it might not. But there's a famine that happens. So she comes back, people take over her property. She has to petition 7 years later. And this might take place sometime after Elisha dies, because Gehazi's there kind of reminiscing with the king of Israel about, oh man, how great Elisha was. And oh, remember that story where he revived that woman or revived that woman's child. And oh man, that was so great. And just as he's saying that, oh my goodness, look who's walking through the door. It's a woman. And so she comes in and explains it to the king and says, oh, of course, get your property back. And so she does. And so that's just kind of a little anecdotal story. But back to our main story. So Elisha arrives to the capital of Damascus, and Ben-Hadad is sick, and he sends his servant Hazael to go and inquire Elisha. You did us all for Naaman. Maybe he might know something about if I'm going to be recovering. And so Elisha goes to Hazael, or Hazael will come to Elisha, and Elisha says, he is going to get better, but he is going to die. He still is going to die from other means. And so he says that, and he cries, and Hazael's like, why are you crying? Prophet, why are you doing that? And he's like, oh, because I know that you're going to rule in his place, and you're going to do all these cruel things to Israel. And he's like, man, I'm just kind of like the paper boy. Like, I don't do anything. Like, why would I, get all this power? And he says that, you're going to be anointed the next king of Aram. So with that, he goes back, and Hazael tells him, oh, you're going to get better. Sure, you're going to get better. And then as he gets better, he will strangle him with some sort of net that's going to be wet, and kill and assassinate Ben-Hadad, and now will be the new king of Aram. So first task knocked out. Next is we're going to get to hear a little bit about Jehoshaphat. So Jehoshaphat will pass away. Joram will be the next king, will rule for 8 years. Ahaziah from the northern kingdom is going to be the next successor to Jehoram after his reign. And then we get to chapter 9, which is going to focus back on Jehu and Israel. So Elisha instructs one of the disciples to go to Ramoth Gilead and to do kind of like a drive-by, just go in and out, just anoint and get the heck out of there. So he's going to go, So there's this war taking place between Aram and Israel, and I guess the Ramoth Gilead, there's a camp there. And so the Israelite generals are gathered around Ramoth Gilead, and the disciples come to this council of generals sitting about, and they ask for, Jehu here, and Jehu is just kind of like the main general, this really infamous, effective soldier and commander of the Israelite army. And he's like, hey, can I have a word with you real fast inside? So he goes and takes him out, and then all of a sudden, here's oil, you're king, bye. And so he leaves, and Jehu comes back, and he's like, hey, what was all that craziness about? And Jehu's like, oh, it's nothing. He's like, no, really tell us. And he's like, oh, well, in the name of Yahweh, they declared me the next king. And everyone's like, whoa. So now everyone is like, the generals are just, throwing their garments in front of him, and he's kind of like parading on it as an act of submission and showing that Jehu is like the next true king of Israel that's going to overthrow the house of Ahab. So they say, don't tell a word of this to Ahab, and he is going to go and confront Ahab himself. So Jehu goes and mounts and arrives in Jezreel, which is up north here, and across the river from where Ramoth Gilead is. And so that's where he's camped at. And so, the watchman, the tower person goes and says, hey, this, Jehu's coming with this big army. And he's like, okay, I wonder what that deal is about. Go see if all is well. And so he goes, and, Jehu's like, get behind me, this is none of your business. So he keeps going, and so, the king is like, oh, okay. So, Ahaziah is like, okay, so, send another messenger, same deal, doesn't get word back. He's like, all right, you know what, I'm just going to go and see for myself what's happening. So during this time, I forgot to mention, during this time beforehand, so Ahaziah is injured during this Ramoth Gilead battle. So he got injured, and Ahaziah, the Judah, Jehoshaphat's son, is visiting him. So they're both together. They're both going to go and visit Jehu. And in Jehu's mind, this is two birds with one stone, because they're both, Yahwehist defectors in his understanding. So he goes, and it just so happens when they meet, they're at Naboth's vineyard, so right outside of Jezreel. Very symbolic, showing that the blood of Naboth is going to be avenged. And so they go and he mocks, he goes and says, it's all well, and instead Jehu mocks his mother for being a sorceress and, insults him, and then just says, oh no, this guy's a traitor. So he goes and tries to warn Ahaziah, the Judah's king, and so right then he gets struck, he gets fatally shot, and so Ahaziah flees, and he too gets shot and killed at the ascent of Gur, so these cliffs over Megiddo right here. In this area. And so he goes and eventually after this revolt gets buried back in Jerusalem. So, Jehu's not finished yet, so he goes back to Jezreel, and Jezebel, of course, is still there, who's yet to pay for her many sins. And so she goes back, and so she is just, knows what's happening, knows that Jehu and not, her son is coming back, so she kind of knows what's up, knows that this is kind of the end of the line for her. So she goes and dresses up all real nice and confronts Jehu at the city gate. And so she's kind of on this gate with this window looking out, and then Jehu's down below confronting her. And so Jezebel kind of mocks Jehu, says, what are you doing here, Zimri? And if you remember Zimri, he was kind of that short-lived person that overthrew Baasha and his dynasty, and then he himself was overthrown overnight by Omri, this general, his own general. So she's kind of poking fun at him. And Jehu is just so awesome. He is apparently just such an intimidating guy. He doesn't even do his own dirty work. So he's just intimidating the eunuchs that are, next to Jezebel. He's like, all right, eunuchs, what side are you on? Are you going to be on the winning side or the losing side? And so, if you're on the winning side, go and throw down this wretched woman. And so the eunuchs will obey Jehu, And so in one of the most graphic descriptions of a death in the Bible, she is thrown out the window and goes to Jehu's army and just splatters on the ground. And of course that's not enough, it scares the horses who stampede on her, and as they're stampeding, they go in to celebrate while this corpse is just kind of, rotting out, with the dogs eating it. And so they're feasting, celebrating, and when they come back to retrieve, okay, at least we got to give her a burial. So they go out, okay, so they go out for a burial, and what's left of her? Just her skull, her feet, her hands, because the corpse has just been so decimated, just as God predicted to Elijah. So next step, so Jehu's all right, so Jezebel's dead, Ahab's dead, Ahaziah's dead, now we got to, secure our power here. So he goes to Jezreel, and first he kills off all of Ahab's loyalists. And once he does that, he sends messengers to Samaria. So remember, Samaria is where the real power in the palace is. So he goes south to let them know that, hey, if anyone wants to challenge me, good luck, basically. And all the people are oh my goodness gracious, Jehu's meaning business, what in the world we're going to do? We have no chance, he's our top general, what can we do? So Jehu says, hey, kill all the royal attendants of Ahab's descendants. And so the attendants get word of this direction, and they're just all right, we're doing the dirty work ourselves. They just go and kill Ahab's royal lineage. So all the princes are killed off and are beheaded and are sent in baskets back to Jehu. And so Jehu kind of uses this for propaganda purposes. He goes and sets the heads on the entrance of Jezreel to show everybody in a public display that, hey, if you're looking for an Ahab successor, here's his head right here. So it intimidates people. He consolidates power in Jezreel. And after that message is sent, then he's going to go back to Samaria to hopefully, secure his throne without any resistance. So he goes back to Samaria, and on his way he finds Jehonabad, kind of his, a friend that's going to help kind of be his right-hand man. And as he goes to Samaria, he just kind of kills off whatever Ahab loyalists were left. And now he's securely the new king of Israel, and the house of Ahab is, as was prophesied, is completely destroyed. So the first order of business is to basically eradicate any Baal worshippers, any worshippers of Jezebel's gods has got to go. And to do this, he's oh my goodness, I'm the biggest Baal fan, Baal fan #1 t-shirt right here. And so he's yeah, we're going to have this big feast and get all the priests, the Baal worshippers, we're going to all go to the central temple and just have a party time sacrifice. And so, little does everyone know that, the house just fills up. And little does he know that there's kind of this army that are just waiting outside, and on his signal during the sacrifice, these 80 soldiers will come down, just slaughter everybody. They'll tear down the pillars and completely tear down the temple and, destroy all the remnants of anything Jezebel related in Samaria. And so after that, we hear about Jehu's legacy. He wasn't perfect, so because, he didn't completely eradicate all of the foreign worship, that he's only going to have 4 successors, so 4 more of his sons and sons' are going to be holding the throne until the next lapse of these coups and overthrows. So next is the story of Athaliah. So Ahaziah is getting really, really close. So if you remember, so the king of Judah at this time is really well connected into and marries into the house of Ahab. So now they're very, very corrupted by the Phoenician influence that's over Judah, our main good guys that we think so far in the story. And because when Athaliah finds out that her son is dead, then she wants to overtake all of Yahweh worship at all. and tried to corrupt it by killing off the lineage of David. So after her son dies, she will kill the rest of her own, grandchildren in order to have power for herself. We talked about how, Bathsheba had this really big status as queen mother, and because of that status, she was basically able to rule in his place if they were ever absent. So Athaliah is unofficially the first queen in Judah's history that we're going to have. Not a very good one, though. So she tries to kill off all the grandchildren, but Ahaziah's sister and the wife of the high priest of Solomon's temple, Jehoiada, is going to go and save this one last child named Joash and hide him in the temple. So, she informs the temple guards and the army that, hey, we have this son that's legitimate. And so the temple guards are really celebrating, and they're going to have this kind of secret ceremony that's going to turn public, that's going to make everyone aware that this is the real deal. So they have this ceremony. The public gets word of it, and Athaliah is like, oh my goodness, hearing rumors, what's this commotion? And goes to the temple, sees that Joash is alive, and Jehoiada is like, that woman's a traitor, she's no longer queen, and so, she, gets executed. They're like, don't do it in the holy temple of Solomon, but go out to, where the cattle are, or the horses are, outside the king's palace, and that's where they will execute her. So she's executed, and Joash, the grandson, will then take place, and, David's lineage is saved. And so he will reign 40 years and have a really good rule. So he's going to actually have a special deposit chest that makes some reforms to get the temple repaired and renovated. And so that's what he's kind of famous for. So there's just like Hazael is going to be this powerful force. He invades Israel, but he also penetrates down south to Judah and will overtake Jerusalem. And Joash, unfortunately, has to pay Aram with a lot of the royal treasuries to avoid any wrath. And unfortunately, his couriers, his court people, two of them will assassinate him. And so, but thankfully, Amaziah his son will still take reign and not the assassins. So next we're going to talk about Jehoahaz. So he is going to be the next king of Israel. Well, unfortunately, the camera battery died, and we'll have to pick up where we left off at and finish up this first part. So we talked about Joash's reign. He ruled in Judah. He got assassinated. Amaziah is his son who will take over Judah, so they're in secure hands for now. Now we're going to turn back to Israel, and we'll learn about Jehu's son. After Jehu passes away, Jehoahaz will become king. Of course, just as Elisha foretold, Hazael will be a major enemy of Israel, and eventually Hazael will go and overtake Israel and invade and turn them into a vassal state eventually. But eventually God will call upon a deliverer, an unnamed deliverer, who will overtake Hazael and be able to get Israel's borders restored. We don't know the name, but we can gather from history and the information we have, it might be Assyria, this rising empire on the other, the eastern flank of Damascus and Aram. Probably had to drive their attention away and weaken them, and so Israel was able to restore their border. Jehoash, after Jehoahaz dies, his son Jehoash will become king, and during his reign we'll hear about the last days of Elisha. So during Elisha's last days, he'll fall ill, and he is visited by the sad king Jehoash. He instructs
the king to go get his bow and arrows. He does so, and the prophet will tell him to go and shoot the arrows for victory over Aram. So he listens to him. He goes get these bow and arrow and shoots it. And Elisha will tell him to go gather the arrows and strike them down on the ground as he grabs them for victory. So he does. He goes, retrieves the arrows, grabs them, strikes it down, and does so 3 times. Elisha will say, "Oh no, why did you do that?" Even though he didn't tell him a specific number. He said that if he would have done this 5 or 6 times, that would have mean he would have had 5 or 6 victories over Aram and completely wipe him out. But because he only did 3, he will have 3 victories that will be guaranteed. And so Elisha's word will be fulfilled, and Jehoash will have 3 major victories to Hazael's son, Ben-Hadad the second. And Elisha will die. And there's this little side note where it ends off where there's this unrelated raid by Moabites who invaded Israel. And during this raid, during this funeral service, they're like, "Oh my goodness, they got to rush and kind of throw him in a ditch," where Elisha's body just so happened to be. And when he touches the bones of Elisha, somehow miraculously this dead man whose funeral happened is revived for a little bit. So that's just a nice side story. And when we continue back to part 2, we're going to focus on the prophets, the latter prophets who we all know and love, Isaiah, Jeremiah. A lot of the written prophets that we see in the New Testament or the Old Testament are going to be, their time period is going to be after the time of Elisha, and we'll have their oracles recorded. They're going to be foreseeing the disaster, this judgment of the nations that have gone astray from God's ways, and this terrible judgment will be fulfilled during the reign of this crazy, powerful nation called Assyria, and later Babylon. And we'll hear more about those stories when we come back in 2 Kings.